14 minutes after I walked out of the contentious settlement conference at the Savannah County Courthouse, I watched my almost former husband, Garrett, hurry his girlfriend into a private fertility clinic for what was unmistakably a prenatal scan. I didn't cry. I didn't demand answers. The anger that rose in me wasn't loud or messy. It was precise. I sat behind the wheel of my parked car, pulled out my black leather folio, and began a calm, methodical shutdown of every comfort his life depended on. This wasn't a meltdown. It was a reconciliation of accounts. They weren't stunned by what they'd done together. They were stunned that I had finally stopped pretending not to notice. Have you ever let someone mistake your patience for weakness, only to remember all at once that you were the one holding every key the whole time? The thick Savannah heat pressed against the windows of my car, but inside the air conditioning ran cold, matching the temperature I felt in my chest. I dialed Walter, our longtime estate attorney and trustee for the Whitmore Family Holdings. I didn't open with heartbreak or mention the clinic. I simply told him it was time to begin full asset containment. The unwinding started immediately. Within minutes, Garrett's supplemental credit cards were shut off entirely. Through the clinic's tinted glass, I watched him stand at the front desk holding his wallet, swiping a card once, then again. His usual swagger cracked into open confusion as the receptionist shook her head. He tried a second card, declined. But the frozen credit was only the first line item. I moved down my list and logged into the corporate access portal. Garrett had 3 company-leased units in the restored warehouse district under his name. I pulled his digital key access with a single keystroke. Next were the company vehicles, 3 SUVs he used to ferry investors around town, all titled under the development firm. I opened the fleet management dashboard and triggered a full remote lockout. Engines disabled, doors sealed electronically. He was standing 50 feet from me, completely stranded, locked out of the life he'd built on borrowed ground. I watched him pace the lobby, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing at no one. A year earlier, watching him panic like that would have sent me running to smooth things over, to quietly absorb whatever mess he'd made. I had spent years being the silent backer of our shared life, covering every shortfall without complaint. Now I just sat there, waiting to feel something like regret, and finding only clarity. The shift in me was complete. I wasn't a protector anymore. I was an auditor, calmly identifying and shutting down an illusion. Everything he showed off around town had been financed by my family's name. He had mistaken access for ownership. I watched his girlfriend reach out and touch his arm, only for him to shake her off in frustration. The walls were closing in, and the doors he assumed would always stay open were slamming shut, locked by hands he'd always assumed were too gentle to turn a key. I closed the Fleet app and pulled up the corporate directory. The opening move was finished. It had taken under 15 minutes to dismantle a lifestyle he'd taken for granted for the better part of 7 years. I pulled out of the parking lot without a second glance. There was no reason to linger and watch the fallout. The real unraveling of Garrett Reyes was only beginning. Driving back toward the historic district, I replayed the long ledger of our marriage in my head. For 7 years, Garrett had treated my career as a preservation architect like a charming hobby. He liked what the family name brought him, the standing at dinner parties, the easy credibility, but he never respected the actual work behind historic restoration. To him, old buildings were inconvenient obstacles to commercial progress. He never understood that he was living inside the very foundation he dismissed. That afternoon, sitting at my late father's drafting table, I traced my fingers over the worn grooves in the wood. This was where the real labor happened. The emotional cost of a hollow marriage was incalculable, but the professional cost was not. It was right there in black and white. My expertise as lead conservator had secured $4.6 million in heritage preservation grants, the very funding that had rescued his over-leveraged commercial projects from foreclosure 3 years earlier. I had quietly propped up his entire career. Looking back, our marriage had been a membership with me covering the dues. There's a strange trap that highly competent people fall into, the illusion that patience equals investment. We convince ourselves that every year of tolerance is another brick laid towards something sturdy, but a parasite doesn't build anything, it only feeds. I had spent 7 years reinforcing a structure for a man who was steadily hollowing out the ground beneath me. I had mistaken closeness for partnership. He never loved my mind. He loved the safety net it gave him. He never respected my legacy. He leveraged it as collateral. Flipping through his project files, I felt the last traces of affection burn off into something purely transactional. I wasn't grieving a marriage. I was auditing a failed venture. He had spent years assuming my calm was weakness, that my devotion to preservation meant I was sentimental, stuck, incapable of decisive action. He never realized that someone who studies structural integrity for a living knows precisely where to strike to bring a building down. I closed the file, squared it against the edge of the table, and let go of 7 years of emotional deficit. From here on, I was dealing strictly in hard assets. He had treated my quiet support like a permanent guarantee, forgetting that a silent investor can pull out at any moment. His entire existence rested on land my family had held for generations, and I was about to take it back. Garrett's response wasn't an apology. There was no attempt at reconciliation, no explanation. Instead, he went on the offensive. By Tuesday, he'd launched a coordinated smear campaign across local development blogs and social media, painting me as a vindictive ex weaponizing old land trusts to choke off progress out of spite. He cast himself as a visionary developer being persecuted by a bitter woman clinging to outdated preservation rules. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't engage in comment sections. I kept a documented, deliberate silence. Reacting to a smear campaign only fuels it. Silence, used correctly, suffocates noise far more effectively than any rebuttal. While Garrett fought a loud, desperate battle in the press, his mother launched a quieter one of her own, sending hostile, manipulative messages directly to my mother, Margaret Whitmore, demanding a large settlement to avoid a public reputation war. My mother, steel-spined as ever, simply forwarded every message to Walter and me. We filed them straight into evidence. Garrett was operating on pure panic, throwing accusations at the wall, hoping something would stick, assuming the threat of embarrassment would force us to cave. He fundamentally misjudged our family. We don't negotiate with liabilities, and we don't pay ransom to people who've already shown their hand. Every post, every frantic text from his mother was logged and archived by Walter's paralegals, each one more proof of erratic, hostile conduct. I watched his digital tantrum unfold from my office with detached fascination. It was almost clinical observing a man realize his access to power had been cut off entirely. He thought this was a public relations war he could win by volume. He had no idea the real fight wasn't happening online. It was happening in zoning records, escrow ledgers, and municipal filings. Let him have his blog posts and his sympathetic commenters. I shifted the entire battle into the professional sphere. On Thursday morning at 8 sharp, I walked into the development firm's headquarters on River Street, flanked by Walter and Renata, a forensic auditor I'd retained on contract. We didn't announce ourselves. We walked straight past reception into the executive offices. Garrett had surrounded himself with loyalists over the years, and they scrambled to block us, demanding appointments, citing his authority as managing partner. I didn't slow down. I handed the lead project manager a stack of legal injunctions, suspending Garrett's operational authority pending internal review. They stepped aside. We seized the zoning logs, the servers, the physical escrow records. Renata's team set up in the main conference room and began tracing transactions across the past year. Within 4 hours, they found serious irregularities buried in the escrow accounts. Funds earmarked strictly for historic restoration had been quietly diverted to cover losses on Garrett's struggling high-rise projects. This is the predictable arc of proximity mistaken for competence. When someone is given long-term access to a legacy they didn't build, they start to believe their nearness to expertise is the same as possessing it. Garrett had spent so long standing next to my knowledge that he'd convinced himself he understood it. He thought he was a mastermind. In reality, he was making careless, fatal mistakes, lacking the foundation to actually manipulate a heritage trust's finances without leaving a trail. He authorized transfers that violated basic compliance standards, assuming no one would dare check his work. He mistook my trust for blindness. Renata slid a printed ledger across the table, pointing to a string of unauthorized municipal transfers. The numbers told the whole story. He'd overextended himself catastrophically, shuffling funds in a desperate shell game to keep his projects afloat while bleeding the family trust dry. That financial mess alone would have ended his career, but what Walter and Renata uncovered late Friday turned corporate negligence into outright criminal fraud. Cross-referencing internal zoning files against the Public Planning Archive, Renata flagged a glaring inconsistency in a set of contested rezoning applications tied to a stretch of protected coastal wetlands. Garrett had been pushing to clear that land for a commercial tower. I had denied those applications myself months earlier, citing environmental and historical protections. Yet there they were in the municipal database, marked approved. I pulled the physical files and laid them flat, stamped at the bottom of each one, authorizing the destruction of protected heritage land, was my official lead conservator seal. I hadn't stamped a single one of them. The signature underneath was a careful, deliberate forgery. To bypass my standards and push his projects through, Garrett had stolen my seal from my locked desk and forged my signature on federal filings, felony fraud committed to liquidate land my family had protected for generations. The room went still as Walter reviewed the documents. This wasn't a marital betrayal or a breach of trust anymore. It was a calculated crime that erased any remaining shred of professional legitimacy. And it triggered something Garrett never saw coming, an ironclad forfeiture clause buried in the original trust charter, written by my grandfather decades ago. Any partner or trustee found committing fraud against the Conservancy would immediately forfeit all equity, shares, and claims tied to the estate. No settlement, no severance, nothing. I traced the forged signature with the tip of my pen. He had assumed my seal was just a formality, an easy thing to bypass. He never understood that by forging my name, he hadn't just damaged his standing in our divorce. He had signed off on his own professional ruin. Walter looked up and asked if I wanted to open settlement talks. I shook my head. You don't negotiate with someone who steals your identity to sell off your legacy. You remove them entirely. I told Walter to hand the forensic files straight to the authorities and file a formal fraud report. This wasn't leverage for the divorce. This was a criminal matter now, full stop. By Monday, the weight of total liquidation finally landed on Garrett. With his real estate empire frozen, his access revoked, every account seized, he showed up unannounced at Walter's office. I was already seated at the conference table when he was let in. The arrogance he'd worn like armor for years was gone. His tailored suit hung loose on him. The man who'd run a public smear campaign days earlier looked hollowed out, cornered. He didn't yell or demand anything back. He saw the forged documents stacked on the table, topped with the drafted criminal referral, and his knees buckled. He sank to the floor right there in the office, face in his hands, sobbing, begging me to drop the referral. He pleaded about his family name, about how a fraud conviction would end his licenses for good. He brought up our 7 years together, promised to walk away with nothing if I'd just keep the district attorney out of it. I looked down at him with total composure. This wasn't remorse. It was a man mourning the loss of everything he'd been feeding off of. He wasn't crying because he'd hurt me. He was crying because his access to my world had finally caught up with him. I felt no pity, no anger, just the quiet satisfaction of numbers finally balancing. I let him sit there for a long moment, letting the silence do its work. Then I stood, looked down at him, and kept my voice level. You spent 7 years assuming quiet meant weak. You mistook my patience for permission. But people who study foundations for a living don't build on anything they haven't secured first. You forged my name to sell my family's land. You were never a partner here, Garrett. You were a tenant, and your lease is over. He opened his mouth to say something else. I didn't wait to hear it. I closed my portfolio, the latch snapping shut like a closing gavel, and walked out, leaving him on the floor with Walter and the evidence. The aftermath was swift and complete. Garrett's commercial permits were pulled the moment the forgery surfaced. Investigators moved fast, and criminal charges followed as his professional credentials were dismantled piece by piece. The forfeiture clause held, and his stripped equity was redirected into a new heritage scholarship fund carrying the Whitmore name, permanently out of his reach. I cut off every line of contact. His calls went unanswered, his emails bounced, and his mother's pleas for leniency were met with nothing but silence from my legal team. I stood by the tall windows of my office one morning, coffee in hand, looking out over the Savannah River as the sun came up. The quiet in that room didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt open. I've learned that staying silent for too long carries a real cost. For years, I absorbed the disrespect, the financial drain, the casual cruelty, telling myself that keeping the peace was the same as keeping things stable. But real peace only comes from being honest with yourself first. Forgiveness, when it happens, isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's just the thing that finally sets you free. But forgiveness doesn't mean letting someone back into your house. Cutting ties cleanly takes a particular kind of courage, the willingness to judge the people who claim to love you by what they actually did, not what they said. Taking real ownership of your own life means accepting that some boundaries have to be backed by something solid: paperwork, law, follow-through. I didn't rebuild my life out of revenge. I rebuilt it because I finally demanded better for myself. Garrett's collapse wasn't punishment. It was just the natural result of building on something that was never his. Looking out over the city I'd spent my career protecting, I felt something settle in me, real and lasting. The Whitmore legacy was secure, not just because of old trusts, but because I had finally stopped being the quiet backer of my own undoing. I turned from the window and walked back to my drafting table. There was new work ahead, new things to build and protect, and a future that finally belonged entirely to me. If this story reminded you that some boundaries only hold when you're willing to back them with action, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and let me know your thoughts in the comments.